to the last full Writing with James of 2019. Next month I'll be doing the year-end edition as we head into the year 2020, and followers of angel numbers rejoice. One thing about coming to the end of 2019, it's not only the end of a year, it's also the end of a decade. And I think the decade is something that has kind of lost its significance for various reasons since we entered the 21st century. It's always been a little bit of a pop culture thing anyway. I don't think they really thought much of, for instance, the decade of the 1850s. But part of the reason for that might have been that, the 1850s, generally speaking, wasn't much different than the 1830s. And really, I think that's why it's lost some of its significance now. We've kind of gone full circle in a way. The 20th century, each decade was just so vastly different. And if you went by 20-year spans, the 1930s were so much different than the 50s, which were so much different than the 70s, and so forth. Now, I do want to mention I am talking about this from an American perspective. If you're from another part of the world, you can probably relate in some way, even though it might still be different where you're from. I guess the 1920s was the first decade to really have their own identity. The Roaring Twenties, the music that was coming out at the time, the rise of jazz and flapper girls, and motion pictures became much more mainstream, and in the United States, baseball was really starting to become the national pastime, with Babe Ruth rising to fame. But then the 1930s were vastly different. It was the beginning of the Great Depression. So we went from great economic prosperity to economic contraction. And you had the rise of the Nazis in Germany and the rise of the mafia in big American cities. And it's generally thought of as a dark time. And then in the 40s, while a lot of those things were still happening, and the U.S. entered World War II, and all of that, it's not really thought of as being so dark because of the way it ended, I think. World War II came to an end, economic prosperity was returning, and on a style note, you had zoot suits, and big band music is very much associated with the 40s, so there's a lot of good things associated with the 1940s. Then we really had big changes in the 1950s. The Great Depression was over and gone, and things that average people couldn't afford, most of their lives before became more common. Televisions were more common in homes. Cars became faster. You had the rise of Elvis Presley and rock and roll. Everyday dress for young people became a little more casual. And despite the fact that it was the beginning of the Cold War and civil rights issues, it's generally thought of as a happy time. Now, for the 1960s, most people associate the decade with what happened in the last couple of years. Most of the 60s were not that much different than the 50s, really. There was just more of it. Cars became even faster, and rock and roll became a little more mainstream. But when people talk about the 60s, they think about really basically 1968, 1969. The rise of the counterculture and hippies and things like that. And again, despite all the bad things that happened in the 60s that you can bring up, the assassinations, the Vietnam War, all of that, people mostly associate the 60s with the talk of peace. Now, partly because of color television coming along in the late 60s, the 1970s are usually thought of as an explosion of color, if it looked good or not. I'm sure some of you that may have been around at the time have seen an orange couch or a green refrigerator somewhere and said, we had one of those when I was a kid. It's like all the rules were gone. Long hair, ugly clothes, disco. A lot of people go straight to disco when they think about the 70s. But things changed a whole lot during the 1970s. With the 1980s, we got our color scheme a little more worked out. Big hair, jean jackets, Jordache jeans, shades. That was basically the 80s. I think it was also the first hint of what would kill the significance of the decade, or part of what would kill the significance of the decade that rose up as technology became a thing. Home video and VCRs became more common. The first cell phones were coming out. Home computers. All of that started becoming much more common in the 1980s. And then you had the 1990s. The last decade of the 20th century, and really the only one that is associated more with what happened at the beginning of it. You still had an 80s influence in the early 90s, but with a 90s taste. The multicolored jackets, spandex was a thing for a while in the early 90s. Some people didn't need to be wearing it. Grunge became a thing for a while, and a lot of people probably associate that with the 90s, but that was really more of a mid-90s blip on the radar screen. The 90s didn't really lend much to a decade-defining style. As the 90s closed, people were concentrating more on the year 2000. There wasn't as much talk about looking back at the decade as it was more about going into the future. Even though the year 2000 was actually the last year of the 20th century and not the first year of the 21st century, yes, I'm one of those people, it was still, changing those first two digits for the first time in people's lives, But even now, when you look back at the 90s, it's the early 90s, really. Early and mid-90s that people concentrate on more than anything. If you look back at a movie or a TV show that came out in, let's just say 1998, for the most part, there isn't anything that screams that it's from the 90s. Maybe it's from 1998, maybe it's from last week. You can't really tell much until someone pulls out a flip phone, or gets on a computer, or takes out that VCR tape. Then it's like, ugh, this is a while back. Unlike something from, say, 1977 that is so obviously from the 70s because of the clothes or the hairstyles, it immediately slaps you in the face. It's the technology that stands out when you get up to the late 90s. And I think that's one of the reasons the first two decades of the 21st century hasn't really left much of a mark as far as that stands out as being from that decade. You're kind of like, when I say something about the 9/11 attacks in 2001, the thing that really dates it is the fact that I, like many people at the time, was on AOL. And people hear that and they're, oh man, really? AOL? The first cell phone I got, which, I was a little late to the cell phone game, it was probably 2002. It only had one game on it. It's called Snake, which was just a black line that moved around the screen. And my phone was, for the most part, just a phone. Didn't have an internet connection or anything like that. But along with all that, there is the fact that we haven't really known what to call these decades. There was a brief discussion what to call the first decade of the 21st century. The ones, the aughts. Some people have kind of jokingly called it the Audis. But there really isn't that one thing in place to call it, like, the 80s or the 70s or whatever. The decade we are leaving, I guess, would be the teens. But, the first 3 years didn't have the word teen in it, 2010 to 2012. So maybe that's a bigger part of it. Maybe as we enter a new decade of the 20s, maybe the significance of the decade will come back simply because we all have this uniform thing to call it. But anyways, what are you hoping for from the 20s? If a decade even means anything anymore. Because it's right around the corner. Okay, I don't really know where I was going with that, but there it is. Sometimes I just start talking. But the year isn't quite over, and neither is the decade. We have one more month. And coming up on this channel, I'll have one more ghost hunting video, with the last one from George TV, the Fam's visit in July. I'm going to try and get another YouTube suggestions together before the end of the year. It'll be the 19th YouTube suggestions. But let me go ahead and put a small bug in your ear about the 20th. There's going to be some special moments in that one. One that I really wanted but didn't know if it would happen came through just a couple of days ago. I was thrilled with it, so get ready for that. I haven't even completed the 19th one and I'm already excited about 20. So be ready for that, hopefully in January. And as far as December, I may also do a little geocaching as well. So anyway, random rambles about decades. That was basically what this one was about. And to close it out, I wanted to go back to one of the more popular videos from this channel in 2019, the filming locations of the last picture show in Texasville. This is the original beginning of the video. I ended up cutting it out because of time, but this was actually the way I wanted to start it. It's a funny little story about the cast of Texasville and what was at least a rumor that went around about one of them. Alright, well, thanks for coming along for the ride. Enjoy the bonus footage, and I will see you next time, one more time in 2019. This might seem like an odd place to start this, because there was nothing called Shoop's Termite and Pest Control in either Texasville or the last picture show. And this isn't even in Archer City. This is in Wichita Falls, Texas. But it does link into the movie Texasville, because this was originally a restaurant, and they actually still have the sign up in honor of this place called Stanley's Barbecue. Let's see, Stanley's #1, home of the Beanie Burger. Now, the Beanie Burger was a huge hamburger, I believe with double meat, double cheese, smothered in chili, and had all kinds of stuff on it. Stanley's originated this burger. A lot of places around here have come up with their own version, but most people will tell you that there is nothing like the original. It is a very popular burger. And when the cast came into the area, of course Archer City is not that far from Wichita Falls, and when they were filming, the cast actually stayed in Wichita Falls, and while they were here they wanted to go to a good local place, and somebody decided Stanley's would be a good place to go. So they all came here to eat. And as I have been told, the Beanie Burger, which is a huge burger, I have trouble getting through one. Sybil Shepherd ate 2 of them.